Hello, everybody. I'm Ramona Schindelheim, Editor-in-Chief of Working Nation, and welcome to our panel today. Today, we're discussing how philanthropy can help close the skills gap. So as everyone here knows, the technology is always changing, and it's always changing the skills you need in the workplace. This group that we've gathered here today even before the pandemic, has been helping fund some of the programs and initiatives that are helping make sure everybody have skills that they need to get a good career and a good job. With the pandemic, that need has accelerated, and also the pandemic has exposed some inequities in the system as it existed before. So today we'd like to explore how we can address those inequities, how we can address the skills gap and the opportunity gap. And I've been asked not to introduce everybody because we can talk about it as we go. So first I'm going to bring up Gayatri Agnew, who's with Walmart.org. And I want to talk a little bit to start, and then everybody join in, on what your thoughts are about where we are now. What have we seen? Because what have we learned from the pandemic about education and skills gap and opportunity gaps? And then everybody welcome to join in.
Thank you so much, Ramona, and good afternoon, everyone. Gayatri Agnew with Walmart and Walmart.org, and we're focused within my org in looking at issues of economic mobility and economic opportunity. So this topic, both of this panel and your question, is something we're spending our time thinking a ton about. I would say three quick things. One, and this is obvious to everyone, is the pace of change, the biggest impact that this moment in time has had on all of us, but especially those of us close to thinking about workforce training, education, and worker mobility. It's a pace of change impact. And so we already had real challenges with the training and education system, particularly for working adults in America. But now, as you've added in the current pace of change, and candidly, as you've added in a lens that is forcing us to be a bit more honest, the racial divides and the racial inequities and how our current training and education system functions, I think we're both seeing a lot more clearly issues and outcomes we maybe didn't see the same way before. And this is broadcasting live from home because my 6-year-old son just joined the party. And Ramona, you said it in your intro, but I think we're looking not just at a skills gap, but at a real opportunity gap in terms of who has access to the training and education tools that they need to build meaningful careers.
So Hector, we talked a little bit about this previously in a couple of conversations about the opportunity gap. And I know Google.org has been working to help make sure that that is closed and that people who need training for jobs now is getting it. Can you talk a little bit about what you guys have been doing and also how you might be thinking about it a little differently now?
Yeah, happy to. Hey, everybody, my name is Hector Mujica, and I lead economic opportunity work for the Americas at Google.org, which is Google's Philanthropy. And similarly to what Gayatri mentioned, we at Google.org have been wrestling with what our role and our place of contribution is around bridging that divide that exists around enabling the communities that currently don't have access and don't have the pathways to enter into the digital economy. How do we pave that bridge? How do we create that connection? We've been doing a lot of work on both on the supply side, which I think is incredibly important, right? So what are the ways that we can be bringing the right skilling solutions and the right techniques more proximate to the individuals that need that otherwise would not have access to those skill sets, and bring it to them in a way that they can adequately access it, right? So how do we bring it to them in a way that's going to be packaged with the right wraparound supports, that is going to be meeting them where they're at with the right supports that they're going to need to be successful at attaining those skills, and then helping them along the way to fulfill those jobs. And I think that's important. I think that's really, really important work that many of us are doing in the workforce development space. And now as I'm thinking about what's next for our investments at Google.org, we have historically seen ourselves as a catalytic funder, as a funder that's really drawn to innovation and systems change. And as we're thinking about systems change, when it comes to workforce development, when it comes to more equitable pathways into the digital economy, I think there's a few things that need to change. And one of them is definitely on the demand side of the house, right? I think there's many of the roads to meaningful employment are very burdened with unnecessary hurdles that reinforce the status quo. And we see that across minority communities. Many minority communities, Latinos, Blacks, they lack college degrees in comparison to the white population. And we tend to also see things like degree inflation, which places non-essential degree requirements on roles that can be fulfilled without those degree requirements. So those are some of those burdens, some of those impediments and roadblocks that we're now beginning to think about and wrestle with, and ask ourselves those really difficult questions of, well, you know, how are these systems stifling opportunity? How are they reinforcing status quo? How are they creating a system of exclusion? And how do we then begin to think about taking a bold risk and asking some of the big questions that oftentimes point to a perpetrator, and that perpetrator could be big companies like ourselves, right? And how do we then wrestle with that? And that's okay, but we need to acknowledge that, and where we go from there is what matters. So that's where we're at right now with this topic at .org.
And Jen, that was something you wanted to talk specifically about and address, about how you are seeing your role as a funder in this area.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so hi everyone, I'm Jen Stradler. I lead the workforce development team at Salesforce. And I think this is such an interesting conversation because many of us on this panel are working in philanthropy, but also in the context of working inside major employers. And so we are always thinking about the partnerships that we can have and continue to build with our colleagues internally, with the business units, with HR and recruiting. And I think a lot of what Hector just mentioned around the burdens for job seekers really reminds me of the equity equality conversation and the role that us as employers need to continue having. So I'm excited that there are a lot of companies thinking differently about sourcing talent, but we can't all start sourcing talent from many of the organizations that we might fund without also thinking about what supports people coming from different backgrounds might need to be successful. So, and again, this goes back to, in my mind, it's really equity and equality. So if we want to really ensure that people who are being trained, not through your sort of more typical four-year elite university degree, are positioned to be successful, then we can't just source talent differently, but we have to support talent differently. And there's a responsibility from employers, in addition to, of course, the many nonprofits that we all work with, to think about meeting people where they are, coaching managers differently, providing more enablement for new employees, to ensure that people have, I picture that image that many of us have seen about the two people standing on different number of boxes at the fence. What are the boxes that we, whether through philanthropy or as employers, need to provide to make sure people are truly seeing over the fence at the same level, regardless of how they've gotten their job?
Have you been looking at this, and I want to direct this to the three of you right now and then bring in the rest. Have you been looking inside a company's culture when you do fund programs, the companies that you're working with? Has that always been part of your criteria?
Mona, I can start on this. You know, it's interesting, especially given the context of this conference, ASU GSV, in part focusing on venture and investment. I think philanthropy is not any different from when you look at investing in a company. The mechanics of the investment are different, but the first thing I look at is leadership, who's leading the organization. Second thing I look at is who's on the board. And for quite some time, as long as I've been a grant maker, I've looked at not just who's on the board, meaning who are they, what groups do they represent, what backgrounds do they come from, but what is the diversity of that board from the sense of representation, specifically relative to the client base that the organization is seeking to serve. And I'm seeing nods from Hector and Jen. That's standard practice. I think actually taking it a step further is where we are now, to your point, starting to look at culture. So not just leadership, CEO background, board dynamics, but how do people of color and all people in the organization we're considering funding feel? Do they feel included by the way the organization shows up in the world? And I think that metric's more relevant than it's ever been for us.
Do either one of you want to jump in on that? Or
I'll say quickly, I very much resonate with what Gayatri just shared. And I've also been really inspired recently by seeing organizations begin to put together sets of best practices and toolkits and solutions that they can recommend to peer organizations, to employers, to larger companies around how to implement anti-racist practices, hiring practices across their organization, how to become a company that truly embraces diversity and diverse cultures and keeps that at its core, right? So I think that this is a really unique moment in time. I think what we're seeing happen with the racial reckoning in the country right now, I think it's going to hopefully will yield meaningful change. And I think that's also going to be true organizationally for many of the groups that we fund and many of the companies that hire the talent that we're hoping to prepare for the jobs of tomorrow.
And Jackie, you go at it through, you represent wealthy donors, individuals, families. And what are you looking at now?
Yeah, and thank you so much, and it's great to be here. But I'm nodding my head so much, so I just kind of wanted to jump through the screen. I think at this point, I would say having a bit of the Deutsche Bank from a corporate view as well, and some of the programs that we have been funding more recently, like incubators that we have been dedicated to, but now are increasing grants to collaboratives, all of which are really looking at creating opportunity regardless of gender, ethnicity, economic background. And so we definitely have seen much more of that from the Deutsche Bank Foundation, which is not the umbrella under which I sit, but I work very closely with. From the individual client and families and the multi-generational families. And we just did a discussion on this actually. One of the most important things that we talk to clients about is really partnering with the organizations that they are making any kind of investment in. And you used the word investment before and grant before, but again, I also look at a grant, it's an investment. And just like you analyze from an ESG perspective, which companies are doing what and what kind of policies they have, that's the same kind of thing that the individual donors and foundations from large families are looking at. And I think for the most part, what's happened more recently in the last 6 months are families that have said, do I actually know the makeup of the board? Do I know really the population that the organization is serving? And if I'm going to commit in an investment to this organization, what are they doing from a policy? Do they have a structure that's set up to actually encourage diversity and inclusion on their board? And so you're starting to see people really analyze it very much, like you mentioned before. I think it may have been Jen who mentioned it, but very much a matter of what is this investment I'm making and how do they act? I mean, the nonprofit community is the third largest employer, right? So when you make a grant or an investment in that population, they shouldn't be looked at any differently than the for-profit from a behavior, policy, ESG, put quotes around that because you would look at them slightly differently. But again, that's what we see donors and families looking at today more than ever.
And Angela, you come at this from also a venture investment point of view. And I want you to talk a little bit about your Future of Work Challenge, because what you're doing with that is something that a couple people have already mentioned. It's about incubators, it's about entrepreneurs, it's about looking for new solutions.
Yeah, so there's two thoughts, and just to double click on some things that we heard here. It's about getting away from the skills gap narrative and talking about the opportunity gap. A colleague just told me, she goes, we can't train our way to equity, right? So we really need to make sure that while we're tuning to accelerated learning programs, we're also thinking about those wraparound supports that need to be there to ensure that people are able to reach their full potential. So with the Future of Work Grand Challenge, we're doing both. So we're partnering with the X Prize Foundation, and MIT Solves. On the X Prize side, we're going to give away about $6 million to entrepreneurs who can come up with accelerated training programs that reduces the time for people to upskill for jobs of the future. And those are ones where you're saying that are not estimated to be automated in the next 3 to 5 years. But we know that training is just not of itself is not enough. So partnering with MIT Solves to think about what are those wraparound supports to help people actually assess the skills they have, right? We have to remember there's 73 million Americans out there with the skills to do higher wage jobs, but the more, as Hector mentioned, that we defer to a bachelor's degree, those people are being left out. We need to know about job placement and also career and navigation. And so in looking at this challenge, we're going to take all of those solutions, select 20 of the most promising ones, and connect them to workforce boards and pilot them in 5 communities across the US, beginning in the first quarter of next year. So again, when we think about equity, this is going to be mostly technology delivered, but we're actually taking it to people in their community through these workforce boards and job centers. And so we just want to make sure that the people who need the training can get that, and who also need the access to the wraparound supports have that opportunity. And I just, lastly, I'm just thinking of every dollar that we invest when we're talking about investing in these entrepreneurs and we're looking at our applications, we're asking about diversity. We're asking about what is their view on proximity? What insights do they have about the communities that they purport to serve that we can also learn from a funder? And with each dollar we invest, Jacqueline is very correct in advising your donors, we're creating a more equitable future of work or a more inequitable future of work. So we really need to think about each dollar we invest in that way.
Do you all look at specific programs, or I've heard, we've talked about wraparound services and also looking at opportunities and making sure people have the opportunities. One of the big hurdles for a lot of people is broadband, access to laptops, et cetera. Are those kind of things that you look at, programs that you look at to try to fund? Anybody can answer that.
I'll start, it's what I call the social determinants of work. And I think we've seen that more than ever with COVID, right? If you don't have childcare, you don't have broadband, you can't do your work. If you don't have transportation, right? And so we are investing in innovations for the Future of Work Grand Challenge. We want innovators to help us think through what does, a new childcare framework look like? What does a new transportation framework look like? So we're inviting those ideas to the table.
I would just add, Ramona, I think, what becomes really hard is to think that they're separate. And I love Angela's framing of the social determinants of work. So, we think through a framework of access to work, stability in work, and mobility into a next job or a job at a next company. And the mobility part, the suggestion we can train our way out of the current crisis, meaning the recession, COVID, and the racial inequality America is experiencing, Angela's exactly right. You can't train your way out of equity because you're not dealing, if you're only looking at training interventions, you're not dealing with the drivers of inequity in access to work, nor are you dealing with the drivers of inequity and stability in work. So I think for us, part of it is the holistic nature with which we have to look at the person, the learner, the worker, the mom, the dad, the learner, right? What are their life circumstances, and how are the programs or initiatives that we may be underwriting or connecting them to going to enable their future mobility? And I don't think you can do that without taking into serious consideration how programs we may underwrite aren't necessarily providing for every needed wraparound service, but are ensuring that the wraparound services needed are identified and met, right? So I think part of this is do you do end to end and one program does everything? And there are programs like that. We fund some of them. There are also initiatives where it's a single point intervention, and that intervention, when coupled with something else, can create deep impact. But the idea that and Hector can speak better to this than I am, just putting the Google IT certificate online isn't enough, which is why they've done so much more than that, right? It's a recognition of that need for the additional support services to support a learner.
I think you have some, Hector, and maybe with the other organizations as well here, other groups here, you have partners who are taking on some of these people that you are helping train.
That's right, and I think that point is exactly spot on in terms of how do we journey with that individual. Not only, like I mentioned earlier, how do we meet them where they're at, regardless of what the circumstances might be, lack of connectivity, lack of childcare, etc. How do we build the right set of structures around that individual to meet them where they're at and then support them in their journey to continue learning, right? I think it's an unrealistic expectation for us to just offer up some curriculum and we say, hey, this curriculum, this box can get you to where you need to be to enter into a meaningful job that can provide upward mobility. Okay, that's great. That solution is going to work for a percentage of the population, a small percentage, not everyone. People are going to lack the devices to be able to leverage that box. They're going to lack the connectivity, the time, the space, the headspace, the coaching that's going to be required, the language skills many times. So that's where we really try to empower our grantees and organizations that we work closely with to meet those learners where they're at, right? Some folks are bringing them financial stipends if that's what they happen to need. They just need some financial breathing room to be able to dedicate their headspace into upskilling. Great, we'll meet you there with a financial stipend. If you need childcare, they'll meet them there with childcare for the duration of that upskill. Right, so I think there's definitely a tremendous value in being able to support learners in whatever situations they find themselves in.
And Jen, I saw you nodding your head in definite agreement with that one too.
Absolutely. I think we see that both with organizations that we are funding. And I agree wholeheartedly with Gayatri's point that it's not a singular expectation that the supports are met in a certain way. I think some organizations do what they do best because it's really niche. And then they have a network of support that doesn't mean their clients or students have to go to 15 different places, but it does mean that it's a coordinated sort of quilt of supports, and then others that are meeting that all needs of an individual under one roof. And so there's different models. And then similarly, like Google, I imagine there are a lot of different training initiatives that Salesforce has to train for roles in the Salesforce ecosystem. So jobs at our customers and partners, roles like Salesforce administrators and Salesforce developers that are in far greater quantity than there ever would be roles at Salesforce. And they're great roles. They have a lot of mobility. They don't require a degree. And we have an abundance of free online training. But similar to what Hector mentioned, free online training for certain populations without additional supports is not enough. And that's why it's really important that there are various external nonprofits and other training providers that are complementing that online free training with other supports, wraparound supports, additional case management, in order to ensure that clients or students can be met based on where their starting point is to ensure that they're successful.
Ramona, I'd love just building, oh, so sorry, Jacqueline. On what Jen said, speaking on a philanthropy panel, I think the power of what we want to invest in at Walmart.org is how you knit together what Jen just described. And so, on a daily basis, we're getting knocks at our door that a new company's created the greatest innovation that will ever be in how you upskill workers and get people back to work and get them wage roles. But it's not a silver bullet single intervention that's needed. It's actually the real magic happens in how you knit together in a user-centered, user to the learner way to really facilitate a process that removes as much friction from the system as possible. So that, Hector, to your point about the headspace to learn, which is probably one of the single greatest barriers to people living in poverty accessing training and upskilling, is just that headspace and capacity and time, and that can't be given. And so if you can remove friction from the system, that does start to return time back to a learner. And so this idea that it's a single intervention versus it's actually how we knit the system together, and that's where really I hope philanthropy can incent partnership and collaborative behavior that ultimately delivers for the learners who need those skills to be able to access better jobs.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that something that we've seen donors and really very specifically from a next gen donor, the next gen of families that are looking at how to be involved. More and more are looking at what is the real circle. You know, what's really happening when I fund the soup kitchen, but there's something else missing when someone goes to the soup kitchen, but they go home and they're in an abusive household, or they go home and their kid may have soup, but they still don't have access to the internet for proper schooling. And so we're seeing more donors when you kind of the overused term of impact, but that's really what it is. It's the sort of the ecosystem of my grant. Where is it going, right? And can I dig several layers down to understand where else I should be funding if I care about this particular issue? And one of the exercises I used with the next gen donor that was funding a soup kitchen was, and you know, why do you care about that you're funding the soup kitchen if it was a child without food? And why do you care about that? Because that child actually can't pay attention to schoolwork. And why do you care about that? And so it's actually pulling back the layers of the onion, so to speak, and really uncovering that whole entire pattern of a grant and the entire system around that individual. Who else is, you know, if you think about the wheel and it's the center, but what are the spokes around the individual that grant's trying to get to? So again, you know, I think for the donors we're seeing, this is critical and has really come to the surface because of everything that's going on over the last 6 months.
You know, I wanted to ask this question. We're going to take questions in just a few minutes, but are you getting any signals from, you know, the community overall on what areas there are opportunities? Because I think we talk a lot about tech. So this is a little bit off of what we've been talking about, but we talk a lot about tech and healthcare as places where you can upskill. Are you getting any signals on any particular industries where there's a need to help people get the skills they need?
I can give one example, and I'm just chuckling because in some ways it's the opposite of the idea of tech and tech services, but plumbers, HVAC operators, right? Especially right now, as people are
Great skills, yeah.
They're right, like trade skills, and you know, it's been said in many future of work reports, but most, not all, but most of those skills don't automate out of the system, right? We're all in our homes, our heat or our AC is breaking. We're needing folks to come in and to repair that. And Walmart actually earlier this year expanded our Live Better You program, which is our learning platform for Walmart associate, to include a suite of trade skills for this exact reason. Ramona, to your question, we have already had digital skills and health pathways in the offering for our associates, but we added trade skills. The other interesting thing about trade skills is, especially for those who are more entrepreneurial, many trades workers often go on to start their own businesses, right? And so I just think it gives people more flexibility, it gives people more options, and it gives people a hard skill that has great value in the US labor market, and that has not changed in recent times. So that's one example of non-health and IT skills.
Anyone else seeing anything? No.
I'll just quickly underline the importance, though, of digital skilling. We saw in a recent Brookings report that since 2010, nearly 2/3 of all newly created jobs will require either medium to high levels of digital skills. So I think that's also another kind of competitive component that we're going to begin to see be more ingrained into all sorts of jobs, whether they're the traditional jobs that we think about when it comes to tech jobs, or whether it be more some of the plumbing jobs or some of the other small business type jobs, where we're going to begin to see digital skilling continue or grow in terms of demand. So just another plug for the importance of those skills.
I would also add, and I think this is really important, especially for those of us in philanthropy, to get our minds and our heads around, is that it's not just to get people into jobs, it's actually to support people retaining and keeping the jobs that they have.
That's a very important point.
You know, especially the digital skills point that Hector makes, you know, the pace of change I referred to at the outset of the panel Walmart has seen this in our workforce, but most of us have seen this in the way we consume goods and the way we interact in our economy, right? The pace of change has been rapid. And on the other side of that pace of change, are worker skills advancing quickly. And the most prominent place where that's occurred is in the digital skills space. And so I think it becomes incumbent upon all of us to ask, what are we collectively doing to ensure that all workers are upskilled to get the digital skills that they need to thrive? And that's not just about placement into future work. It's absolutely about maintaining current roles.
Yeah, I just had a conversation not too long ago with Joe Fuller, who's at Harvard, and he constantly is talking to business leaders, and he was just talking to them about the pandemic and what they're changing. And so he's saying, just like any recession, when you come out of it or when you start recovering, the way people do their work is changing. I mean, somebody who's working in retail may now do, back office stuff and may do front office stuff. And those are all digital generally. You have to use cash register. You have to use, maybe Salesforce, Salesforce. Yeah, a lot of people need to learn that, right? So it is, your job may not go away, but it may change. So this idea of lifelong learning. So programs, I'm always curious if there are programs out there for older workers, more, mid-career people that are, have you seen any of those that you've funded or that you've considered?
So we really focus more from a community lens than from a demographic lens of worker. And I'll just give an example of a project in South Bend, Indiana. Walmart.org actually together with Google supported a project called Bendable, which is an aspiration to turn the city of South Bend into a lifelong learning city. Because the reality is, irrespective of age, there's a need in our changing economy to place more of a premium than we have in the past on the capacity of an individual to learn. And so the skill that we really want to see grow in more individuals is learning, right? Like is a hunger to learn. So it's not an explicit or specific skill. It's the ability to engage in learning and keep that curiosity about sort of the future with them. And that will propel them further forward. So that's one example of an initiative that we funded. It's run through the South Bend library system. And what it does is it aggregates and manages, sort of removes the friction, as I was saying earlier, to unlock access to as much learning as possible from as many different platforms, and then ties it to local supports and initiatives that can help different learners, depending on where they're at, persist through that learning.
I'd love to hear from each of you about a program that you really like, a program that you think is doing, and Gayatri, you just gave us a good example, I think, but a program that you really like that you would like to call out and say, this is what we think is we funded this because we think they're doing it right. Is a question that I just threw out at everybody. Sorry.
Yeah, Ramona, there's just so many of them, but I'll just talk about two that I'm most excited about. One is an organization called Daughters of Rosie, and it was founded by a woman who had a manufacturing company, but she realized that when she looked to her left and right, there weren't a lot of women who were working beside her, and specifically there weren't a lot of people of color. And when she started to narrow in on like the skills that you needed to have to get these entry-level manufacturing jobs, most of them were just beginning professional skills. Some people might call them soft skills. So she started a nonprofit arm to begin training people. So people who were formerly Uber drivers or Lyft drivers, they could train and start these entry-level jobs in manufacturing where they were making 30% more. They had benefits. But again, it was like for her, it took her looking to her left and right and seeing who was not beside her. So that's one program I love. The second one that we invested in is Codepath. They're really working with universities, working with, historically Black colleges and universities, and thinking about like, how do they integrate their learning? They had worked with, major tech companies on a for-profit side. How do they take that learning and take it to colleges and take it to universities where traditionally students weren't getting access to this type of curriculum, so that they can have it, pair them with mentors, and actually are getting them placed in jobs, again, with higher wages. And what that means, right, is just generational wealth and just changes for not only for themselves, but their families.
You know, I want to make a mention, the Daughters of Rosie. I've seen a couple of programs. There's one, women at Work, I think in New York, and then another one that trains Latina women to be welders. And these are all jobs that are family sustaining. They have benefits, skilled trades, as we were talking previously. But I love those, and I will try to get from you guys each a list. You know, I'll put the I'll put the URLs, the websites on workingnation.com when I get a chance. Who else would like to share some?
I can jump in, and I'll talk about sort of a body of work that we have been investing in with a couple of examples, and it's been really an evolution for us. So our work at Salesforce is focused on education and workforce development, like many of us. And of course, we know those two areas are deeply interconnected, but they're kind of two separate portfolios, though we work very closely. And historically, our workforce development had primarily been for the most part, young people who were not in school. So the education was sort of in school and the workforce development was kind of out of school. But I think it's important for all of us, of course, to evolve pre-pandemic, even more so now. And I think all of us probably have seen that in the education space, this idea of the American dream being achieved with a college degree is a total falsehood. And so we were seeing a lot of organizations working with young people who are either in college or recently graduated, often first generation, low income, often going to public schools, not necessarily the elite universities that major Fortune 100 or 500 companies are hiring from, and seeing that without social capital and without networks and without paid internships, that they were struggling to get a degree related job. And so we built out an area of our work that's looking at that space. So interventions that can happen in college, organizations like Braven that are helping young people connect to networks and internships while they're in college in a 4-credit course. Organizations like Co-op that work with young people who are recently graduated and or underemployed, and help them get the labor market relevant skills in data analytics and technical sales and digital marketing to bridge the gap. And it's often a gap that we've promised these young people. If you have this degree, you will succeed. And we've failed them. And so there's fortunately and unfortunately a bunch of newer organizations that have stepped in to help young people fill that gap. I'm so glad they're there. I wish they didn't have to be, but that's an evolution in our work that we've started to fund in the last couple of years.
I love that. I love that.
I would just add very quickly, we're funding something called Pursuit, and Pursuit has a fellowship and a bond piece. And the bond is the investor piece that's actually tied to the job outcomes of the fellowship program. It's a 4-year training program and essentially bring workers into high-skilled software engineers. And so I like the idea of the fellowship, but I really like the idea of the Pursuit bond. I do think that more and more philanthropy needs to look at the investment piece, the individual investment piece, and not just the grant piece, and tie it back for investors. I think that's the way we move forward with big change, is tying the two together, and Pursuit does that really nicely.
And I'll close this out from my perspective. Some of the organizations that excite me the most are not necessarily because of the way that the implementation or the way that they're tackling the work, but because of the communities that they're addressing. So one of the ones is the Ywca. We've been working with the YW to really build up their digital skilling and workforce development initiatives across the country. what we really like about these federated models is they have mass scale. We've also worked with Goodwill in the past, et cetera. So they reach, thousands of women with a scaled solution. And they've been really, really thoughtful about leveraging things like employer-backed credentials, such as the Google IT Professional Support Certificate, in how they train and equip these women, how they meet the women where they're at with the right wraparound supports to enable them into the right pathways for jobs. So that's one I've been really excited about. And then another one that's kind of a level up is Hispanic Federation. We've been working with them to build up a kind of a digital excellence hub where they're going to be working with Latino serving organizations that are working in the workforce development space to build up their capacity, to build up their stamina and their energy and their know-how in how they teach workforce development and digital skilling and preparedness for the digital economy. So those are two slightly different approaches. One is directly addressing the need with the end recipients. The other one's building capacity with organizations that are working in the workforce development realm, but both that are tackling groups and serving groups that much need that level of support.
And I'm getting a 1 minute warning here, so getting ready to wrap up. And I think I was very heartened to hear this conversation today. I feel like there's a lot of really good people out there doing really good work to make sure that not just the skills gap is closed, but as we've all said, the opportunity gap is closed. And I do think COVID's really shown that that's needed more now than ever. It was there before, but it's exposed it even more. And I thank you all for your good work.
Our pleasure.
So with that,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we've been talking with Angela Jackson from New Profit, Jacqueline Velouche from Deutsche Bank, Jen Stredler from Salesforce.org, Hector Mujica from Google.org, and Gayatri Agnew from Walmart.org. So with that, I say thank you and